In the heart of the Syrian desert, roughly equidistant between the Mediterranean coast and the Euphrates River, there is an oasis where springs of mineral-rich water have supported human settlement for thousands of years. The ancient inhabitants called the place Tadmor, a name that appears in texts going back to the early 2nd millennium BCE, but the city that grew around this oasis became known to the wider ancient world by another name, Palmyra, a name the Greeks and Romans used, and that has become the name by which the site is known today. The specific position of this oasis, isolated within a vast expanse of desert but situated precisely along the most direct route between the Mediterranean world and the river systems of Mesopotamia, gave Palmyra a strategic significance that no city without this exact combination of water, isolation, and position could have achieved. For most of its early history, Palmyra was a modest settlement, important locally as a source of water and as a stopping point for travelers crossing the desert, but not yet the great trading metropolis it would become. The transformation began in earnest in the centuries following Alexander the Great's conquests, as the trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to India, Central Asia, and China grew increasingly active and increasingly valuable, carrying silk, spices, gems, and other luxury goods across enormous distances through a chain of intermediary cities and merchants. Palmyra's position, controlling the most practical route across the open desert between the Roman-controlled Mediterranean coast and the Euphrates crossing points that led toward Persia and beyond, placed the city at one of the most lucrative choke points of this entire trading system. By the 1st century of the Common Era, Palmyra had transformed itself into one of the wealthiest cities of the Roman East, its prosperity built not on agriculture or manufacturing, but on the specific commercial function of organizing, financing, and protecting the caravan trade that passed through its territory. The city's merchants organized themselves into caravan associations that financed expeditions across the desert to the Euphrates and beyond, hiring guards, securing water and provisions along the route, and managing the complex financial arrangements that allowed goods to move profitably across thousands of kilometers of trade routes connecting civilizations that otherwise had little direct contact with each other. The wealth this trade generated transformed Palmyra's built environment into one of the most architecturally distinctive cities of the ancient world. The Great Colonnade, a monumental street lined with columns extending for more than a kilometer through the heart of the city, the Temple of Bel, one of the largest and most architecturally sophisticated religious structures of the Roman Near East, and the distinctive tower tombs that rise from the surrounding hills in a funerary tradition found nowhere else in the Roman world, together created an urban landscape that combined Greco-Roman architectural vocabulary with local Semitic religious tradition and artistic sensibility in a synthesis that is unmistakably and uniquely Palmyrene. The specific aridity of the Syrian desert surrounding Palmyra, while a constraint on agricultural productivity that limited the city's ability to feed itself from purely local resources, also gave the oasis its specific strategic value. Since the desert that made travel through the region difficult and dangerous for the unprepared also made the oasis's water and provisions essential for anyone attempting to cross the same terrain, a paradox of scarcity and value that runs through much of Palmyra's economic history. The specific challenge of crossing the desert between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean coast, a journey of several days through territory with limited water and exposure to both natural hazards and the risk of raiding by nomadic groups, meant that organized caravans needed local expertise, secure water sources, and protective escort services that Palmyra was uniquely positioned to provide. The specific demographic composition of ancient Palmyra reflected its commercial function, with the city's population including not only the local Aramaic-speaking population whose ancestors had inhabited the oasis for millennia, but also Greek-speaking settlers and administrators who arrived following the Hellenistic period reorganization of the broader Near East. Roman officials and soldiers stationed in the city as the broader Roman administrative and military presence in the region grew, and a continuously shifting population of merchants, caravan workers, and travelers from across the broader trading network that connected Palmyra to distant regions of the ancient world. The specific seasonal patterns that governed caravan trade through Palmyra, shaped by the practical constraints of desert travel during the most extreme summer heat and by the broader seasonal rhythms of agricultural production and trade good availability across the wider network connecting the city to distant markets, would have given Palmyrene commercial life a distinctive annual rhythm, with periods of intense caravan activity and corresponding civic and religious celebration likely concentrated in the more favorable traveling seasons of spring and autumn. The specific political status of Palmyra within the broader framework of Roman provincial administration evolved considerably over the centuries of the city's prosperity, reflecting both the city's growing wealth and importance and the broader Roman strategy for managing the eastern frontier of the empire where it bordered the rival Parthian and later Sassanid Persian empires. Palmyra's relationship with Rome began as that of a client city maintaining considerable local autonomy while acknowledging Roman overlordship, a status common to many cities in the Roman East that allowed local elites to maintain their traditional governing institutions and their control over local commercial and religious affairs, while the broader framework of provincial administration handled matters of imperial concern including taxation, military security, and relations with foreign powers. The specific institutions of Palmyrene civic government, including a city council and various civic offices that show clear influence from Greek and Roman municipal traditions while incorporating distinctly local elements, reflect this hybrid status as a city that was simultaneously part of the Roman administrative system and substantially self-governing in its day-to-day affairs. The Emperor Hadrian's visit to Palmyra in 129 CE, during his extensive tour of the eastern provinces, marked a significant moment in the city's formal relationship with Rome, and the city was granted the status of a free city, with the honorific title Hadriana Palmyra commemorating the emperor's visit and the privileges associated with it. This formal recognition reflected the established importance of Palmyra within the broader economic and strategic framework of the Roman East, and the city's elite responded to this enhanced status with an intensified building program that produced many of the most significant architectural monuments still visible at the site today. The further elevation of Palmyra's formal status under the Severan dynasty in the early 3rd century, when the city received the status of a Roman colony with its citizens granted the more extensive rights of Roman citizenship, reflected the continuing growth of Palmyra's importance to the Roman state, particularly as tensions with the Sassanid Persian Empire, which had replaced the Parthians as the dominant power in Mesopotamia and Persia in 224 CE, made the security and loyalty of Rome's eastern frontier cities an increasingly urgent strategic concern. The specific administrative integration of Palmyra into the broader Roman provincial system, while substantial, never entirely erased the city's distinctive local character, and the survival of Aramaic as a primary language of civic and religious life alongside Greek and, to a more limited extent, Latin, throughout the period of Roman rule, illustrates the genuine cultural pluralism that characterized Roman administration of the eastern provinces, where local elites were expected to participate in the broader cultural and political framework of Roman imperial rule while retaining substantial autonomy in matters of local language, religious practice, and cultural identity. The specific economic relationship between Palmyra's formal Roman provincial status and its practical commercial autonomy meant that the city's wealthy merchant families occupied a particularly advantageous position within the broader Roman imperial system, benefiting from the security and infrastructure that Roman provincial administration provided, including the broader network of Roman roads and the military protection that Roman frontier garrisons offered against the threat of Persian incursion, while retaining the substantial commercial freedom and local administrative autonomy that allowed Palmyrene merchants to organize, finance, and profit from caravan trade according to their own established commercial practices and institutions. The specific evidence for Palmyrene military organization prior to the 3rd century crisis, including inscriptional references to Palmyrene units serving within the broader Roman military structure and archaeological evidence for the specific equipment and tactical approaches that Palmyrene heavy cavalry employed, suggests that the military capacity that would later prove decisive in both Odenathus's campaigns against Persia and in the broader Palmyrene rebellion against Rome had deep roots in the city's earlier history of organizing armed escorts and security forces to protect valuable caravan shipments crossing dangerous desert territory. The specific relationship between Palmyrene military capacity and the broader Roman frontier defense system illustrates a recurring pattern in Roman frontier management, in which the Roman state frequently relied on locally raised and locally led military forces, often drawing on populations with specific regional expertise and motivation, to supplement the formal legionary forces stationed along the empire's extensive frontiers, a pattern that gave frontier regions like Palmyra both genuine military significance within the broader imperial defense system and the specific military capacity that would later enable Palmyrene rebellion against the same imperial authority that had originally cultivated and relied upon that capacity. The caravan trade that was the economic foundation of Palmyrene prosperity operated through a sophisticated and well-documented commercial system whose specific mechanisms are unusually well preserved in the epigraphic record of the city, particularly through the famous Palmyrene tariff, a bilingual inscription in Greek and Aramaic that records the specific customs duties levied on goods passing through the city. The Palmyrene tariff, inscribed on a massive stone stele and dated to 137 CE, documents an extraordinarily detailed schedule of customs charges applied to a wide range of goods including olive oil, salt, dried foods, slaves, and various luxury items, along with specific provisions governing the taxation of caravans, the grazing of pack animals, and various other commercial activities associated with the long-distance trade that passed through Palmyrene territory. The specific detail and sophistication of this taxation system, which required considerable administrative capacity to assess and collect, illustrates the central importance of trade revenue to the Palmyrene civic economy and the corresponding investment that the city's government made in regulating and profiting from this commercial activity. The specific organizational structures through which Palmyrene merchants conducted their long-distance trade are documented through a substantial corpus of honorific inscriptions, many of them set up by caravan associations to honor individuals who had organized, financed, or protected specific trading expeditions. These inscriptions name caravan leaders, identify the specific destinations of trading expeditions, including locations as distant as the Persian Gulf port of Kerosene and various cities of Mesopotamia, and document the specific honors, including statues erected in the city's most prominent public spaces, that successful caravan organizers received from the merchant community whose interests they had served. The specific goods that moved through Palmyra connected the city to an extraordinarily wide geographic range of production and consumption. Silk from China, spices from India and Arabia, pearls from the Persian Gulf, and various other luxury goods moved westward toward the Mediterranean markets of the Roman Empire, while Roman manufactured goods, glassware, and other Mediterranean products moved eastward toward Mesopotamia, Persia, and ultimately toward India and beyond, making Palmyra one of the critical nodes in the vast network of exchange relationships that the modern world has come to call the Silk Road, even though the specific Palmyrene segment of this network has received considerably less popular attention than the more famous Central Asian routes. The specific role of Palmyrene merchants as intermediaries in this broader trading system, rather than as the original producers or final consumers of the luxury goods that passed through their hands, meant that Palmyrene commercial wealth depended specifically on the city's logistical and financial expertise, its ability to organize secure and efficient passage for goods across a particularly difficult stretch of the broader trade route, rather than on the production of any specific commodity that Palmyra itself could claim a monopoly over. This intermediary commercial function, while less visible in the archaeological record than direct evidence of manufacturing or agricultural production might be, nonetheless generated the substantial wealth that funded Palmyra's monumental architecture and that made the city one of the most prosperous urban centers of the Roman Near East. The specific documentary evidence for Palmyrene long-distance trade extends beyond the city's own inscriptional record to include references in broader Roman and Near Eastern historical and geographical sources, which consistently identify Palmyra as a critical node in the trade connecting the Mediterranean world to the broader markets of Mesopotamia, Persia, and ultimately the more distant sources of silk, spices, and other luxury goods in India, Central Asia, and China, confirming the broader historical significance that the city's own epigraphic and archaeological record documents in such specific commercial detail. The specific comparison between Palmyrene caravan trade and other documented long-distance trading systems of the ancient world, including the maritime trade networks that connected the Roman Mediterranean to India via the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, illuminates the broader diversity of commercial mechanisms through which luxury goods moved across the ancient world, with Palmyra's specific overland caravan system representing one particularly well-documented example of a broader pattern of long-distance exchange that connected civilizations across enormous geographic distances through multiple parallel and sometimes competing trade routes. The specific competitive relationship between the Palmyrene overland route and these alternative maritime trading systems likely fluctuated across the centuries depending on broader political conditions, including the security situation along the Red Sea and Persian Gulf routes and the specific state of Roman relations with Parthia and later Sassanid Persia, which controlled the territory through which Palmyrene caravans needed to pass to reach the Euphrates crossing points and the broader markets of Mesopotamia beyond. The religious life of Palmyra reflects the same hybrid character that characterizes the city's architecture and broader cultural identity, combining local Semitic religious traditions with Greco-Roman religious vocabulary and artistic conventions in a synthesis that produced some of the most distinctive religious art and architecture anywhere in the Roman world. The Temple of Bel, the largest and most architecturally significant religious structure in Palmyra, was dedicated to a supreme deity whose worship combined elements of the Mesopotamian god Bel or Marduk with local Semitic religious traditions specific to the Palmyrene oasis. The temple's architectural form, a large enclosed sanctuary surrounded by a colonnaded courtyard in a plan that follows broader Near Eastern temple traditions while incorporating distinctly Greco-Roman architectural details including Corinthian columns and classical entablature, exemplifies the specific synthesis of local and imported architectural vocabulary that characterizes Palmyrene religious building generally. The Palmyrene religious pantheon included a specific triad of major deities, Bel, Yerubal, and Aglabal, whose worship is documented extensively in the inscriptional and artistic record of the city, along with numerous other deities of more local or specialized significance whose specific spheres of religious concern, whether protection of caravans, fertility, healing, or other practical concerns of daily life, reflect the specific religious needs of a merchant community whose prosperity depended on successful and safe long-distance trade. The specific iconography developed for these deities in Palmyrene art, which combines recognizably Mesopotamian and Semitic religious symbolism with the artistic conventions and technical sophistication of Greco-Roman sculptural tradition, represents one of the most distinctive achievements of Palmyrene religious art. The Temple of Balshaman, a smaller but architecturally significant religious structure dedicated to a sky deity whose worship is documented across multiple sites in the broader Syrian region, exemplifies the same hybrid architectural vocabulary visible at the Temple of Bel, combining a traditional Semitic temple plan with refined Corinthian columns and other classical architectural details in a synthesis that Palmyrene architects and patrons clearly considered both religiously and aesthetically appropriate to the specific cultural identity of their city. The specific religious calendar and ritual practice associated with Palmyrene temple worship, documented through inscriptional evidence and through the broader comparative study of related religious traditions across the ancient Near East, suggests a religious life organized around regular festivals and ceremonies that brought the broader Palmyrene population together for collective religious observance, reinforcing both religious devotion and civic identity in ways that paralleled but did not simply replicate the broader patterns of civic religious practice documented elsewhere in the Roman world. The specific scale and architectural ambition of Palmyra's major temples, designed to accommodate substantial crowds during these collective religious observances, reflects the genuine civic as well as religious significance that temple worship held within the broader social fabric of Palmyrene urban life. The specific priesthoods responsible for maintaining Palmyrene temple worship, documented through inscriptional evidence that records the names and family affiliations of individuals who held priestly office, suggest that religious leadership within Palmyrene society was closely connected to the same wealthy merchant families whose commercial activities generated the broader prosperity that funded temple construction and maintenance, illustrating the close integration between religious, commercial, and civic leadership that characterized Palmyrene elite society more generally. The specific iconographic program developed for Palmyrene deities, particularly the distinctive combination of military dress and divine attributes used to depict gods associated with protection and martial power, reflects the broader concerns of a merchant society whose prosperity depended on successful protection of valuable goods moving through potentially dangerous territory, giving Palmyrene religious art a distinctly practical dimension that connected divine worship directly to the everyday commercial and security concerns of the broader population. The specific votive offerings and dedicatory inscriptions recovered from Palmyrene temple sites, documenting individual acts of religious devotion by merchants seeking divine protection for specific caravan expeditions or expressing gratitude for safe return from dangerous journeys, provide intimate glimpses into the personal religious experience of ordinary Palmyrene merchants whose individual voices rarely survive in the broader historical record dominated by the honorific inscriptions of the city's wealthiest and most prominent citizens. The funerary architecture of Palmyra represents one of the most distinctive contributions of Palmyrene civilization to the broader architectural tradition of the ancient world, and the specific forms that Palmyrene tomb architecture took, particularly the distinctive tower tombs found nowhere else in comparable form, document both the wealth of Palmyrene elite families and the specific cultural values that shaped how this wealth was expressed in the commemoration of the dead. The tower tombs of Palmyra, multi-story stone structures rising as high as 5 stories and containing hundreds of individual burial niches arranged in a systematic grid pattern across their interior walls, represent a distinctively Palmyrene funerary innovation that allowed extended families to construct a single monumental structure capable of housing the remains of multiple generations of family members. The interior walls of these tower tombs were typically decorated with portrait sculptures of the deceased, carved in a distinctive Palmyrene style that combines Roman portraiture conventions with specifically local approaches to dress, jewelry, and the depiction of social status, producing one of the richest bodies of funerary portraiture surviving from the Roman world. The underground hypogea, subterranean tomb complexes that represent an alternative to the above-ground tower tombs and that became increasingly common in the later centuries of Palmyrene prosperity, similarly contained extensive systems of burial niches decorated with portrait sculpture, and the elaborate painted decoration that survives in several of the best-preserved hypogea, including detailed mythological scenes and decorative programs that combine classical and local artistic elements, provides some of the best evidence for Palmyrene painting, a medium that survives much less completely than the more durable sculptural and architectural evidence. The specific portraiture style developed in Palmyrene funerary art, characterized by frontal poses, detailed rendering of elaborate jewelry and clothing that documents the specific fashions and status markers of Palmyrene elite society, and a particular formal quality that some art historians have characterized as more concerned with documenting social status and identity than with naturalistic representation in the manner of mainstream Roman portrait sculpture, represents one of the most studied and most distinctive bodies of provincial Roman art, illuminating the specific social structure and cultural values of Palmyrene elite families through the visual record they chose to leave for their descendants. The specific economic investment that Palmyrene families made in funerary architecture and portraiture, often representing one of the most substantial expenditures that a wealthy Palmyrene family might undertake across multiple generations, reflects the genuine cultural importance that commemoration of the dead held within Palmyrene society, comparable in its scale and ambition to the investment that elite families elsewhere in the Roman world might make in residential architecture, civic patronage, or other forms of conspicuous consumption that documented and reinforced social status. The specific choice to invest this wealth in funerary monuments rather than primarily in residential display, while not unique to Palmyra, represents a distinctive cultural emphasis that the surviving archaeological and artistic record allows scholars to document with unusual precision. The specific techniques used in Palmyrene funerary sculpture, including the particular approach to carving facial features, rendering jewelry and clothing detail, and composing the overall format of individual portrait busts, can be traced through stylistic development across the centuries of Palmyrene prosperity, allowing art historians to construct a relative chronology of Palmyrene funerary art that complements the absolute dating evidence provided by inscriptions, and that illuminates broader patterns of stylistic change and continuity within this distinctive regional artistic tradition. The specific role of women within Palmyrene funerary commemoration, documented through numerous portrait busts depicting elite Palmyrene women in elaborate jewelry and clothing that documents the specific fashions and status markers available to women of considerable wealth and social standing, provides valuable evidence for the social position of women within Palmyrene elite society, a position that, while still operating within broader patriarchal structures common to the ancient Mediterranean world, appears to have afforded Palmyrene women a greater degree of public visibility and commemorated social status than was typical in many other regions of the Roman world. The specific genealogical and family relationship evidence preserved in Palmyrene funerary inscriptions, which frequently identify the deceased's relationship to other family members commemorated within the same tomb complex, allows historians to reconstruct detailed family trees for several prominent Palmyrene families across multiple generations, providing valuable evidence for broader patterns of family structure, inheritance, and social continuity within Palmyrene elite society that complements the more commercially focused evidence preserved in the city's caravan and customs inscriptions. The political crisis that engulfed the Roman Empire in the middle of the 3rd century, a period that modern historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, characterized by rapid succession of short-lived emperors, military rebellion, economic instability, and sustained external pressure from both Germanic peoples on the European frontiers and the Sassanid Persian Empire in the east, created the specific historical circumstances within which Palmyra's brief but dramatic emergence as an independent imperial power became possible. The Sassanid Persian king Shapur I's invasions of Roman territory in the 250s, which included the catastrophic defeat and capture of the Roman Emperor Valerian in 260 CE, an unprecedented humiliation that left the eastern Roman provinces dangerously exposed to further Persian aggression with no effective imperial response available from a Roman central government consumed by simultaneous crises on multiple fronts, created a power vacuum in the Roman East that the Palmyrene ruling family, led by a local notable named Septimius Odenathus, moved decisively to fill. Odenathus, who held a combination of local Palmyrene civic authority and formal Roman military rank, organized military forces, likely drawing heavily on the specific skills and resources of the Palmyrene merchant elite and the broader population's familiarity with desert warfare and logistics developed through centuries of organizing and protecting caravan trade, and won a series of significant victories against the retreating Persian forces, effectively stabilizing the Roman eastern frontier. At a moment when the central Roman government was unable to provide effective defense. In recognition of these services, Odenathus received a series of escalating Roman titles, eventually including the title King of Kings, a title with specific resonance in the context of the Persian imperial tradition that suggests Odenathus's ambitions extended beyond merely defending Roman territory toward establishing his own position as a major independent power in the region. The assassination of Odenathus around 267 CE, in circumstances that remain incompletely documented in the surviving historical sources, brought his wife Zenobia to the effective leadership of Palmyra, ruling formally as regent for her young son Vabalithus, but in practice exercising independent authority that would, within a few years, escalate into open rebellion against Roman authority and the establishment of a short-lived but historically significant independent Palmyrene empire. the specific military resources and organizational capacity that allowed Odenathus to mount effective resistance against Persian forces, at a moment when the formal Roman imperial government proved unable to organize comparable resistance, drew significantly on the specific logistical expertise and material resources that Palmyrene society had developed through centuries of organizing and protecting long-distance caravan trade across difficult desert terrain, illustrating how the commercial infrastructure built to support peaceful trade could, under the right circumstances, be rapidly converted to military purposes when the broader political situation demanded it. The specific title King of Kings that Odenathus assumed, with its clear resonance within the broader tradition of Near Eastern and specifically Persian imperial titulature, suggests that Odenathus understood his own position not merely as a loyal Roman military commander defending imperial territory, but as a ruler in his own right whose authority derived from a combination of Roman recognition and a more independent claim to regional leadership rooted in the broader political traditions of the Near East, a dual identity that would become even more pronounced and more openly challenging to Roman authority under his widow Zenobia's subsequent rule. The specific circumstances of Odenathus's assassination, which the ancient sources attribute variously to a conspiracy involving a relative seeking personal advancement or to broader political tensions within the Palmyrene ruling elite that remain only partially documented in the surviving historical record, illustrate the broader uncertainty that characterizes much of what can be known about the internal political dynamics of Palmyrene society during this critical transitional period, even as the broader outcome of Odenathus's death, the transfer of effective power to Zenobia, is documented with greater confidence across multiple independent ancient sources. The specific question of how Zenobia herself understood and justified the assumption of effective political power following her husband's death, in a society whose formal political structures generally assumed male leadership even where women like Zenobia might exercise substantial informal influence, remains difficult to answer with confidence given the absence of any surviving sources that record Zenobia's own perspective in her own words, leaving historians dependent on the often hostile or, at minimum, externally observed accounts of Roman writers who had their own specific political and cultural reasons for emphasizing certain aspects of her rule while minimizing or omitting others. Zenobia, whose specific background and family origins remain subjects of historical debate given the limitations and biases of the surviving ancient sources, emerges from the historical record as one of the most remarkable and most historically significant women of the ancient Mediterranean world, a ruler whose brief but dramatic political and military career challenged Roman imperial authority more directly and more successfully than almost any other regional power of the 3rd century. The ancient sources describe Zenobia as a woman of considerable intellectual accomplishment, fluent in multiple languages including Greek, Aramaic, and reportedly Egyptian, with a particular interest in philosophy and literature that led her to patronize prominent intellectuals including the Neoplatonist philosopher Cassius Longinus, who served as an advisor at her court and who the sources suggest played a significant role in shaping the political and intellectual character of her rule. While these accounts, written primarily by Roman sources hostile to Zenobia's rebellion, must be read with appropriate critical caution regarding their specific accuracy and their underlying biases, the consistent emphasis across multiple independent sources on Zenobia's intellectual sophistication suggests a genuine historical reality behind the literary embellishment. Zenobia's specific political program, following her assumption of effective power after Odenathus's death, involved both the consolidation of Palmyrene control over the Roman eastern provinces that her husband had effectively governed and a more ambitious campaign of territorial expansion that brought Palmyrene forces into Egypt, one of the most economically vital provinces of the Roman Empire, by 270 CE. The specific motivations behind this Egyptian campaign, whether driven primarily by economic considerations related to securing Egyptian grain supplies and trade revenue, by broader strategic calculations about establishing a defensible territorial base for an independent Palmyrene state, or by more personal ambitions related to Zenobia's own dynastic claims, which some ancient sources connect to a claimed descent from the Ptolemaic Queen Cleopatra, remain debated among historians. The formal declaration of imperial independence, in which Zenobia's son Vabalithus assumed the full imperial titles previously reserved for the legitimate Roman emperor, including the title Augustus, represented the definitive break with Roman authority that transformed what had begun as an extension of legitimate Roman military and administrative authority into open rebellion against the Roman state. A transformation that occurred sometime around 271 to 272 CE, and that set the stage for the direct military confrontation with Rome that would determine the fate of the independent Palmyrene state. The specific administrative and military structures that Zenobia maintained during her period of effective independent rule, which appear to have closely followed the established patterns of Roman provincial administration even as the broader political relationship with Rome deteriorated into open conflict, suggest that Zenobia's rebellion was conceived less as a rejection of Roman administrative and cultural models and more as an assertion that Palmyra and its ruling dynasty deserved equal or even superior status within a broader political framework that continued to draw heavily on Roman precedent even as it explicitly challenged Roman authority. The specific coinage that Vabalithus and subsequently Zenobia herself issued during this period, which initially depicted Vabalithus alongside the legitimate Roman Emperor Aurelian in a formula that suggested junior partnership within the broader Roman imperial system before later issues dropped this acknowledgement of Roman seniority entirely, documents the specific escalation of Palmyrene political ambition in concrete numismatic form, providing historians with a precisely datable sequence of evidence for the progressive deterioration of the relationship between the Palmyrene ruling family and the legitimate Roman imperial government. The specific military campaigns that extended Palmyrene control beyond Egypt into portions of Asia Minor during the height of Zenobia's independent rule demonstrate the genuine scope of the territorial ambitions that the Palmyrene leadership pursued during this brief period of imperial assertion, encompassing a substantial portion of the Roman East that, had Zenobia's rebellion ultimately succeeded, would have constituted a major independent successor state controlling some of the most economically valuable provinces of the Roman Empire. The specific administrative challenges that Zenobia's expanded territorial control would have presented, requiring the Palmyrene leadership to manage a substantially more diverse and more geographically extensive set of provincial administrations than the city had previously overseen, illustrate the genuine ambition and the genuine administrative capacity that the Palmyrene ruling family demonstrated during this brief period, even though the ultimate failure of the broader rebellion means that historians can only speculate about how effectively this expanded Palmyrene state might have functioned had it achieved lasting independence from Roman authority. The Roman response to Palmyrene rebellion was organized by the Emperor Aurelian, one of the most militarily capable rulers of the troubled 3rd century, whose specific campaign against Zenobia and the Palmyrene forces in 272 and 273 CE represents one of the most dramatic and most consequential military confrontations of the period. Aurelian's campaign proceeded methodically through Asia Minor and into Syria, defeating Palmyrene forces in a series of engagements that demonstrated the superior discipline and tactical sophistication of the Roman legions even against the specific combination of heavy cavalry and desert warfare tactics that had served Palmyrene forces effectively in their earlier campaigns against Persian forces. The decisive battles near Antioch and Emesa in 272 CE broke the main Palmyrene field army, forcing Zenobia to retreat to Palmyra itself, where Aurelian's forces subsequently besieged the city. The siege of Palmyra in 272 CE ended with the city's surrender after Zenobia's attempt to flee eastward to seek Persian assistance was intercepted by Roman cavalry, and Zenobia herself was captured and brought before Aurelian. The specific fate that befell Zenobia after her capture is documented inconsistently across the surviving ancient sources, with some accounts suggesting she died during transport to Rome, others suggesting she was executed following Aurelian's triumph in Rome, and the most commonly accepted account suggesting that she survived to live out the remainder of her life in comfortable retirement in Italy. having been paraded in Aurelian's triumphal procession as a captured enemy ruler before being allowed to settle into a dignified, if politically powerless, retirement. Palmyra's specific treatment following its surrender in 272 CE was initially relatively lenient, with the city retaining much of its physical infrastructure and population, but a subsequent rebellion in 273 CE, triggered by the Palmyrene population's resistance to the Roman garrison that Aurelian had installed in the city, prompted a much harsher Roman response, with Aurelian's forces sacking the city and inflicting destruction from which Palmyra's status as a major regional power center never recovered, even though the city continued to exist as a settlement of reduced but still significant size for several more centuries. The specific strategic and symbolic significance that Aurelian's victory over Zenobia held within the broader context of his reign, which historians have generally credited with substantially stabilizing the Roman Empire following the worst disorders of the 3rd century crisis, meant that the suppression of Palmyrene rebellion became one of the signature achievements that Aurelian's propaganda and subsequent historical memory celebrated, with Zenobia's capture and the display of her as a captured enemy ruler during Aurelian's Roman triumph serving as a powerful symbol of restored imperial authority and military competence after decades of crisis and humiliation. The specific archaeological evidence for the destruction inflicted during Aurelian's suppression of the 273 CE rebellion, including burn layers and other indicators of violent destruction documented in various excavated sections of the ancient city, provides physical confirmation of the historical accounts describing Roman retribution against the rebellious city, even as the substantial continued occupation of Palmyra in subsequent centuries, documented through later architectural additions and continued inscriptional evidence, indicates that the city's destruction, while severe, did not represent a complete abandonment of the site. The specific historical memory of Aurelian's campaign against Palmyra, preserved in Roman historical writing that generally celebrated the emperor's restoration of imperial unity following the chaos of the mid-3rd century, established a historical narrative in which Zenobia's rebellion was framed primarily as a dangerous challenge to legitimate Roman authority that required forceful suppression, a framing that subsequent historians have increasingly complicated by attending more carefully to the specific local Palmyrene perspective and to the broader structural factors within the Roman imperial crisis that created the conditions for Palmyrene rebellion in the first place. The specific role that Aurelian's broader military reforms, implemented in the years following his suppression of Palmyrene rebellion, played in the longer-term stabilization of the Roman imperial system illustrates how the specific crisis that Palmyra's rebellion represented contributed, paradoxically, to strengthening rather than permanently weakening the broader structures of Roman imperial authority, as the emperor's successful response to multiple simultaneous challenges including the Palmyrene rebellion and the roughly contemporary Gallic separatist state demonstrated that the Roman imperial system retained sufficient underlying strength to overcome even the most serious internal challenges of the 3rd century crisis. The specific lessons that Aurelian's broader military and administrative reforms offered to subsequent Roman emperors, particularly regarding the management of overextended frontier territories and the danger of allowing successful regional military commanders to accumulate excessive independent authority, influenced Roman imperial policy for decades following Aurelian's own brief reign, illustrating how the specific crisis of Palmyrene rebellion left a lasting institutional legacy that extended well beyond the immediate military and political consequences of Zenobia's defeat. The architectural and artistic legacy of Palmyrene civilization, surviving in the extensive ruins that remained substantially intact from antiquity until the catastrophic destruction inflicted by the Islamic State organization between 2015 and 2017, represents one of the most architecturally distinctive and most extensively documented archaeological sites of the Roman Near East. The Great Colonnade, the monumental column street that formed the primary processional and commercial axis of the ancient city, extended for more than a kilometer through the heart of Palmyra, lined with more than 1,500 columns at its full extent, connecting the city's major religious, civic, and commercial structures in a unified architectural composition that gave the ancient visitor moving through the city a continuous experience of monumental architectural grandeur. The specific engineering and logistical achievement represented by the construction and maintenance of this colonnade, requiring the quarrying, transport, and precise installation of an enormous quantity of dressed stone columns, documents the substantial wealth and organizational capacity that Palmyra's caravan trade revenue made possible. The monumental arch, a triumphal arch structure marking a significant bend in the Great Colonnade's path and incorporating sophisticated architectural solutions to the specific geometric challenges presented by this change in direction, represents one of the most architecturally innovative structures in the Palmyrene urban landscape and its elaborate decorative program, including detailed relief carving and architectural ornament, exemplifies the high level of craftsmanship that Palmyrene architects and sculptors brought to even the more purely functional elements of the city's monumental infrastructure. The Roman theater, a substantial entertainment structure built in the standard Roman architectural form, but incorporating specific decorative and architectural details that reflect local Palmyrene artistic sensibility, documents the broader cultural Romanization that accompanied Palmyra's formal political integration into the Roman provincial system, even as the city maintained the distinctive local religious and funerary traditions that gave Palmyrene civilization its specific cultural character within the broader framework of Roman provincial culture. The Agora, the city's main public square and commercial center, surrounded by porticos and incorporating numerous statue bases that once held honorific statues of prominent Palmyrene citizens, particularly successful caravan leaders and civic benefactors, documents the specific civic culture of public honor and commemoration that characterized Palmyrene urban life, in which successful commercial achievement was publicly celebrated and permanently commemorated in ways that reinforced the broader social hierarchy of Palmyrene merchant society while also providing models of civic virtue and commercial success for the broader population to emulate. The specific water management infrastructure that supported Palmyra's substantial urban population in an environment of severe natural aridity, including aqueducts, cisterns, and the careful management of the oasis springs that gave the city its fundamental reason for existing, represents an underappreciated but essential dimension of Palmyrene engineering achievement, without which the substantial urban population that Palmyra's commercial prosperity attracted and sustained could not have survived in this otherwise hostile desert environment. The specific residential architecture of wealthy Palmyrene families, documented through excavated house structures that incorporated elements of Roman domestic architectural planning alongside locally adapted features suited to the specific climatic and cultural requirements of desert urban life, provides an important complement to the better-known religious and funerary architecture of the city, illuminating the broader domestic context within which Palmyrene elite families lived alongside the public monuments through which they expressed their wealth and status. The specific craft production evidence recovered from Palmyrene excavations, including workshops associated with textile production, metalworking, and the carving of the funerary portraiture for which the city is particularly well known, documents the broader productive economy that existed alongside Palmyra's better documented role as a trading and transit center, illustrating that the city's prosperity, while substantially dependent on caravan trade, also rested on a more diversified economic base that included genuine local manufacturing and craft production. The specific agricultural production that the Palmyrene oasis and its immediately surrounding territory supported, while insufficient to feed the city's full population without supplementary imports, nonetheless provided an important local food source that reduced the city's complete dependence on imported grain and other foodstuffs, illustrating how Palmyra's economy combined genuine local agricultural production, documented craft manufacturing, and the better-known caravan trade revenue into a more diversified and more resilient economic foundation than a purely trade-dependent narrative of the city's prosperity might suggest. The modern rediscovery and archaeological documentation of Palmyra, beginning with the visits of European travelers in the 17th and 18th centuries and continuing through systematic archaeological excavation in the 20th century, transformed Palmyra from a romantic ruin known primarily through travelers' accounts and artistic depictions into one of the most thoroughly documented archaeological sites of the ancient Near East. The visit of English merchants and travelers to Palmyra in 1678, and the subsequent more extensive documentation expedition led by Robert Wood in 1751, which produced detailed architectural drawings and descriptions that were published in Europe and that significantly influenced European neoclassical architecture through their introduction of specific Palmyrene architectural forms and decorative motifs to European audiences, represents one of the earlier and more historically significant episodes in the broader European rediscovery of classical antiquity that characterized the 18th century intellectual movement. Systematic archaeological excavation at Palmyra, beginning in the early 20th century under French Mandate authority following the First World War and continuing under Syrian governmental authority following independence, progressively revealed the full extent of the city's monumental architecture and produced the detailed understanding of Palmyrene history, religion, and artistic tradition that contemporary scholarship reflects. The specific contribution of Syrian archaeologists and heritage professionals to this ongoing documentation and conservation effort, building on the foundational work of earlier European expeditions while bringing specifically Syrian national and scholarly perspectives to the interpretation and presentation of the site, represents an important but often under-recognized dimension of Palmyra's modern archaeological history. The designation of Palmyra as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1980 recognized the site's exceptional universal significance as one of the most important archaeological complexes of the ancient world, a designation that brought international attention and conservation resources to the site in the decades before the Syrian civil war and the subsequent occupation of the site by Islamic State forces transformed Palmyra's situation from a celebrated and actively visited archaeological treasure into a site of international concern and, eventually, catastrophic loss. The specific contributions of individual scholars and archaeological missions to the broader documentation of Palmyra throughout the 20th century, including detailed epigraphic publications that made the substantial corpus of Palmyrene inscriptions available to international scholarship, architectural surveys that documented the precise dimensions and construction techniques of the city's major monuments, and broader historical and art historical studies that situated Palmyrene material within the wider context of Roman provincial culture, collectively built the substantial scholarly foundation that allows contemporary historians and archaeologists to understand Palmyra's history and significance with a level of detail that few other archaeological sites of comparable scale and importance can match. The specific photographic and artistic documentation of Palmyra produced by generations of travelers, archaeologists, and artists, extending from the earliest 18th century engravings through 20th century photography and into the detailed digital documentation produced in the years immediately preceding the site's destruction, created an unusually rich visual record that has proven invaluable both for scholarly study and for the broader public communication of the site's significance. A visual archive whose value has only increased in the aftermath of the physical destruction that this same documentation now serves to help us remember and potentially reconstruct. The specific role that Palmyra played in the broader European artistic and architectural imagination following its 18th century rediscovery, influencing neoclassical architectural design across Europe and inspiring numerous artistic depictions that helped establish Palmyra as one of the iconic images of romantic ruin in European cultural consciousness, illustrates the broader cultural significance that the site achieved well beyond the specific scholarly community engaged in its archaeological documentation, embedding Palmyra within a much wider European cultural imagination of the ancient Near East. The specific scholarly disagreements that have characterized the study of Palmyrene chronology and architectural development, including ongoing debates about the precise dating of various phases of construction at major monuments like the Temple of Bel and the Great Colonnade, illustrate the genuine complexity involved in reconstructing detailed historical chronologies from archaeological and epigraphic evidence alone, even at a site as extensively documented and as thoroughly studied as Palmyra, where the absence of a single comprehensive textual history comparable to those available for some other major ancient civilizations leaves considerable room for ongoing scholarly revision and debate. The Syrian Civil War, beginning in 2011, and the subsequent occupation of Palmyra by forces of the organization known as the Islamic State, first from May 2015 to March 2016, and again briefly in December 2016 through March 2017, brought catastrophic destruction to one of the most significant archaeological sites of the ancient world and represents one of the most consequential episodes of deliberate cultural heritage destruction in recent history. The Islamic State's specific ideological justification for the destruction of ancient monuments, framed as opposition to idolatry and to forms of cultural and religious expression deemed incompatible with the organization's specific interpretation of Islamic doctrine, targeted some of the site's most significant religious structures for deliberate demolition, including the complete destruction of the Temple of Balshamin in August 2015 and the substantial destruction of the Temple of Bel later. That same month, attacks that eliminated or severely damaged structures that had survived in substantially intact form for nearly 2,000 years. The execution of Khaled al-Assad, the Syrian archaeologist who had served as the head of antiquities at Palmyra for more than 4 decades and who was murdered by Islamic State forces in August 2015 after reportedly refusing to reveal the location of valuable antiquities that had been hidden from the occupying forces, represents one of the most documented and most widely condemned individual losses associated with the broader catastrophe of Palmyra's occupation, a death that the international archaeological and heritage preservation community has treated as emblematic of the human as well as the material costs of cultural heritage destruction in conflict zones. The specific destruction of the Lion of Aulat, a monumental limestone sculpture that had stood at the entrance to the Temple of Aulat and that represented one of the most significant examples of pre-Roman Palmyrene sculpture, and the destruction of several of the city's distinctive tower tombs, including specific examples that had been among the best preserved and most architecturally significant funerary structures at the site, document the broader scope of cultural destruction that extended beyond the most internationally publicized losses at the major temples to encompass a wide range of the site's archaeological and artistic heritage. The specific looting and illicit trafficking of Palmyrene antiquities that accompanied the broader destruction of the site's standing monuments represents an additional and in some ways more insidious dimension of the cultural heritage catastrophe, as portable artifacts removed from the site, including funerary portrait busts and other sculptural fragments, entered international illicit antiquities markets, creating ongoing challenges for international law enforcement and cultural heritage protection efforts attempting to identify, recover, and eventually repatriate looted Palmyrene material. The subsequent recapture of Palmyra by Syrian government forces, the period of renewed Islamic State occupation and further destruction, and the eventual final recapture of the site, have left Palmyra in a condition of substantial but not total destruction, with significant portions of the ancient city, including substantial sections of the Great Colonnade and various other structures, surviving despite the catastrophic losses inflicted on the site's most prominent religious monuments, creating both the technical challenge and the broader cultural and political questions involved in any future effort to document, conserve, and potentially reconstruct what remains of one of the ancient world's most significant cities. The specific international response to Palmyra's destruction, including widespread media coverage, official condemnation from governments and international organizations around the world, and the broader mobilization of the international archaeological and cultural heritage preservation community, established Palmyra as one of the defining symbols of the broader pattern of deliberate cultural heritage destruction that has characterized numerous contemporary conflicts, even as the specific circumstances of Palmyra's destruction, occurring at a site of such exceptional historical significance and such substantial prior international scholarly attention, gave this particular instance of destruction an unusually high international profile. The specific use of Palmyra's destruction in broader international political discourse, including its invocation in debates about international intervention in the Syrian conflict and in broader discussions about the relationship between cultural heritage protection and international humanitarian law, illustrates how the fate of a single archaeological site became entangled with much broader and more contentious political questions extending well beyond the specific technical and scholarly concerns of archaeological preservation. The specific question of how to respond to the destruction inflicted on Palmyra, encompassing both the immediate technical challenges of documenting and stabilizing what remains and the broader and more contested questions about whether and how to pursue physical reconstruction of destroyed monuments, has generated significant debate within the international heritage preservation community. The specific technical documentation that exists for Palmyra prior to its destruction, including detailed photogrammetric and laser scanning surveys conducted by various international research teams in the years before the Syrian civil war, provides an unusually complete digital record of the site's pre-destruction condition that has enabled both detailed scholarly study of what was lost and the technical planning for potential future reconstruction efforts, illustrating the broader value of comprehensive digital documentation as a form of cultural heritage preservation that can partially mitigate the consequences of physical destruction, even when it cannot prevent that destruction from occurring. The broader theoretical debate about the appropriate response to deliberate cultural heritage destruction, which encompasses fundamental disagreements about whether reconstruction efforts risk creating inauthentic replicas that obscure rather than honor the historical reality of destruction, whether reconstruction can serve important psychological and political functions for affected communities seeking to reassert cultural continuity in the aftermath of conflict, and what specific technical and ethical standards should govern reconstruction efforts where they are pursued, has been particularly active in the specific case of Palmyra given the site's exceptional historical significance and the high public profile of its destruction. The specific political and economic circumstances of contemporary Syria, including the continuing instability and limited resources available for large-scale heritage conservation projects in a country that has experienced more than a decade of devastating civil conflict, mean that the practical questions of what conservation and potential reconstruction work can actually be undertaken at Palmyra in the near term remain subject to considerable uncertainty, even as the broader international community continues to debate the theoretical and ethical questions that any eventual reconstruction effort would need to address. The specific precedent of post-conflict heritage reconstruction efforts at other historically significant sites, including the reconstruction of various European monuments destroyed during the Second World War and more recent reconstruction projects at archaeological and cultural heritage sites affected by other contemporary conflicts, provides comparative context that informs but does not fully resolve the specific debates surrounding Palmyra, since each case of heritage destruction and potential reconstruction involves its own specific combination of technical possibilities, political circumstances, and community priorities that resist simple generalization from one case to another. The specific role that international cultural heritage organizations, including UNESCO and various national and international archaeological institutions, have played in documenting, advocating for, and providing technical and financial support for Palmyra's eventual conservation illustrates the broader international cooperative framework that has developed for responding to cultural heritage destruction in conflict zones, even as the practical effectiveness of this framework remains constrained by the broader political and security circumstances that determine what conservation work can actually be undertaken on the ground. The specific technical challenges involved in any future reconstruction effort at Palmyra extend beyond simply replicating the original appearance of destroyed structures to encompass complex questions about which historical phase of construction should be prioritized for reconstruction, given that many of the site's major monuments had themselves undergone multiple phases of construction, modification, and repair across the centuries of Palmyrene history, and about how to integrate the inevitable use of modern construction materials and techniques with the historical authenticity that heritage reconstruction projects generally aim to achieve. The specific community consultation processes that have begun to inform planning for Palmyra's eventual conservation, involving Syrian heritage professionals, local community representatives, and international archaeological experts in ongoing discussions about appropriate priorities and methods for any future conservation work, reflect a broader evolution in international heritage preservation practice toward more genuinely collaborative and locally grounded approaches to post-conflict reconstruction, moving away from earlier models that sometimes prioritized external expert judgment over local community perspectives and priorities. The specific historical significance of Palmyra within the broader history of the Roman Near East extends beyond its architectural and artistic achievements to encompass what the city's history illuminates about the broader dynamics of trade, cultural exchange, and political relations that characterized the eastern frontier of the Roman world. Palmyra's specific position as a node connecting the Roman Mediterranean world to the broader trading networks of Mesopotamia, Persia, and ultimately Central Asia, India, and China, documents the genuine interconnectedness of the ancient world's major civilizational zones, challenging persistent popular conceptions of ancient societies as isolated and self-contained units with limited awareness of or contact with distant civilizations. The specific commercial mechanisms through which this exchange operated, including the caravan organization, customs administration, and financial arrangements documented in the Palmyrene epigraphic record, illuminate the genuine sophistication of ancient long-distance commercial systems and the substantial wealth that successful management of this trade could generate for cities positioned at strategic points along major trade routes. The specific cultural synthesis visible throughout Palmyrene art, architecture, and religious practice, combining local Semitic traditions with Greco-Roman artistic and architectural vocabulary in a distinctive regional variant of broader Roman provincial culture, illuminates the genuine cultural pluralism and local adaptation that characterized Roman imperial rule in practice, challenging simplified narratives of straightforward cultural homogenization under Roman authority in favor of a more nuanced understanding of how local communities throughout the Roman world adapted, transformed, and ultimately made their own the broader cultural and political framework of Roman imperial rule. Zenobia's specific historical significance, as a woman who briefly but genuinely challenged Roman imperial authority and who has subsequently become an important symbol in modern Syrian, Arab, and broader Middle Eastern historical consciousness, illustrates the complex ways in which ancient historical figures and events continue to carry contemporary political and cultural significance, with Zenobia's specific historical memory invoked across a wide range of modern political contexts in ways that reflect contemporary concerns and aspirations as much as they reflect the specific historical reality of her 3rd-century rebellion against Rome. The specific historiographical tradition surrounding Zenobia, which developed substantially through Byzantine and later European scholarly engagement with the surviving classical sources describing her rebellion, has produced a body of historical interpretation and popular legend that sometimes exceeds what the limited and biased ancient sources can actually support, requiring careful historical methodology to distinguish between the historically documented core of Zenobia's actual political and military activities and the substantial layer of later legendary and interpretive elaboration that has accumulated around her historical memory across the centuries since her actual 3rd-century rebellion. The specific modern Syrian and broader Arab nationalist appropriation of Zenobia's historical memory, which has invoked her as a symbol of regional resistance to external domination and as an example of effective female political leadership within the specific cultural and historical context of the ancient Near East, illustrates the broader pattern through which modern political movements draw on ancient historical figures to construct usable historical narratives that serve contemporary political and cultural purposes, a pattern that historians must account for when attempting to disentangle the historically documented Zenobia from her subsequent symbolic and political afterlife. The specific representation of Zenobia in later artistic and literary tradition, including numerous European paintings, operas, and literary works that depicted her capture and her presentation before Aurelian as a moment of particular dramatic and emotional intensity, demonstrates the broader appeal that Zenobia's story held for audiences far removed from the specific historical and political context of 3rd century Palmyra, a testament to the enduring power of her narrative as a story of ambition, defeat, and dignified survival. The specific scholarly debate about the most historically accurate way to characterize Zenobia's political ambitions, whether as a genuine bid for Palmyrene independence from Roman rule, as an attempt to claim equal partnership within a reformed Roman imperial system, or as a more opportunistic response to the specific power vacuum created by Roman imperial weakness during the 3rd century crisis, reflects the broader interpretive challenges involved in reconstructing the specific political intentions of historical actors whose own voices and perspectives survive only indirectly through sources written by their eventual opponents. The broader comparative significance of Palmyra within the history of Roman provincial cities illuminates both the specific achievements of Palmyrene civilization and the broader pattern of urban development and cultural synthesis that characterized the Roman Near East as a whole during the centuries of Roman imperial rule. The comparison between Palmyra and other major trading cities of the Roman Near East, including Petra in the Nabatean kingdom and various cities of the Decapolis region in the southern Levant, illuminates both the specific factors that made Palmyra's particular combination of desert oasis location and strategic trade route position so exceptionally lucrative, and the broader pattern through which Roman provincial administration created conditions that allowed local commercial elites in multiple regions of the Near East to accumulate substantial wealth and to express that wealth through ambitious architectural and artistic patronage that combined local cultural traditions with imported Greco-Roman forms. The specific economic relationship between Palmyra's caravan trade revenue and the broader Roman imperial economy, in which Palmyrene customs revenue and the broader flow of luxury goods through Palmyrene territory represented both a significant source of tax revenue for the Roman state and a critical mechanism through which Eastern luxury goods reached the broader Mediterranean consumer markets that sustained elite Roman demand for silk, spices, and other exotic imports, illustrates the genuine economic interdependence between frontier provincial cities like Palmyra and the broader imperial economic system, even as cities like Palmyra maintain substantial local autonomy in their day-to-day commercial and administrative affairs. The specific trajectory of Palmyra's rise to prominence, its brief emergence as an independent imperial power under Zenobia, and its subsequent destruction and gradual decline following the failed rebellion against Rome, illustrates the broader pattern through which the specific opportunities created by Roman imperial crisis could allow ambitious regional powers to challenge central imperial authority, even as the underlying military and administrative resources of the Roman state, once effectively mobilized under capable leadership like that of Aurelian, ultimately proved sufficient to suppress even the most successful of these regional challenges to centralized imperial authority. The specific comparison between Palmyra's brief imperial challenge under Zenobia and the roughly contemporary Gallic Empire, a separatist Roman state that emerged in the western provinces during the same broader period of 3rd century crisis and that similarly drew on regional military and administrative resources to establish temporary independence from central Roman authority before being eventually reincorporated into the broader Roman imperial system, illustrates the broader pattern through which the specific stresses of 3rd century crisis created opportunities for regional power centers across multiple different areas of the Roman world to assert temporary independence, even though the underlying structural unity and resources of the broader Roman imperial system ultimately proved sufficient to restore centralized control in both cases. The specific economic and demographic decline that affected Palmyra following the suppression of Zenobia's rebellion, while severe, was not absolute, and the continued archaeological evidence for occupation, construction, and commercial activity at the site through the 4th and into the 5th centuries CE documents a gradual rather than immediate transformation in the city's fortunes, reflecting the broader pattern through which Roman provincial cities affected by political crisis or military conflict typically experienced gradual rather than instantaneous decline, even where that decline ultimately proved permanent in its broader historical consequences. The specific archaeological evidence for Palmyra's continued occupation into the Byzantine period, including church construction that documents the city's eventual Christianization following the broader religious transformation of the late Roman world, and subsequent Islamic period occupation that incorporated elements of the ancient city into a smaller but still functioning settlement, illustrates the broader pattern of cultural and religious layering that characterizes many sites in the region, where successive religious and political transformations left their own distinctive material traces alongside the substantial remains of the earlier Roman and Palmyrene periods. The specific architectural and artistic influence that Palmyrene funerary art exercised on broader regional artistic traditions throughout the Roman Near East, visible in stylistic parallels documented at various other sites across Syria and the broader Levant, suggests that Palmyra functioned not merely as an isolated center of distinctive local artistic production, but as an influential node within a broader regional network of artistic exchange and stylistic influence that extended well beyond the specific commercial trade routes for which the city is most famous. The ongoing scholarly and public engagement with Palmyra's history and heritage, even in the aftermath of the catastrophic destruction inflicted during the Syrian civil war, continues to generate new research, new public interest, and new debates about how the international community should approach the preservation and potential reconstruction of one of the ancient world's most historically and culturally significant cities. The specific scholarly research conducted on Palmyra in the decades before the Syrian civil war, including detailed epigraphic studies of the Palmyrene tariff and the broader corpus of Palmyrene inscriptions, architectural and art historical studies of the city's distinctive funerary and religious architecture, and broader historical research into Palmyra's economic and political role within the Roman imperial system, established a substantial scholarly foundation that continues to inform contemporary understanding of the site, even as physical access for new archaeological work remains limited by the continuing instability of the broader Syrian political and security situation. The specific public and political significance that Palmyra's destruction acquired during the period of Islamic State occupation, becoming one of the most widely covered and most internationally condemned episodes of cultural heritage destruction in recent history, has generated broader public awareness of the importance of archaeological and cultural heritage preservation that extends well beyond the specific case of Palmyra to inform broader international policy discussions about the protection of cultural heritage in conflict zones and the specific legal and institutional mechanisms available for preventing and responding to deliberate cultural heritage destruction. The specific role that digital documentation and virtual reconstruction technologies have played in allowing the broader public to continue engaging with Palmyra's history and significance even in the absence of the physical site's full accessibility, including detailed virtual reality reconstructions and digital archives that incorporate pre-destruction photography, laser scanning data, and scholarly documentation, illustrates the broader potential for digital technology to serve important educational and cultural preservation functions even where physical access to a heritage site remains limited or where the physical site itself has suffered substantial destruction. The specific future of Palmyra, encompassing both the practical questions of ongoing conservation and potential reconstruction work and the broader symbolic significance that the site continues to hold for Syrian national identity, for the broader Middle Eastern historical consciousness that connects contemporary populations to the deep historical heritage of the region, and for the international community's broader commitment to preserving humanity's shared cultural heritage, remains a subject of ongoing discussion and planning, even as the practical circumstances necessary for major conservation work remain constrained by the continuing political instability of the broader Syrian situation. The specific generational dimension of Palmyra's cultural significance, in which the destruction of the site during the Syrian civil war occurred within living memory of Syrians who had visited Palmyra as a major domestic and international tourist destination before the conflict, gives the site's loss a particularly immediate and personal quality for the Syrian population, distinguishing it from heritage destruction that occurred in more distant historical periods and that consequently lacks the same immediate emotional resonance for contemporary communities, even where the underlying cultural and historical significance of the destroyed heritage is comparably substantial. The specific psychological and cultural function that heritage sites like Palmyra serve for displaced and diaspora Syrian communities, many of whom have been forced to leave their homeland as a direct consequence of the same broader conflict that destroyed the ancient city, adds a further dimension to the site's contemporary significance, transforming Palmyra from a purely archaeological concern into a living symbol of cultural continuity and national identity for communities scattered across multiple countries by war and displacement. The specific role that Syrian heritage professionals have played in continuing to advocate for and plan around Palmyra's eventual recovery, even while working under conditions of considerable personal risk and institutional constraint, represents one of the more quietly heroic dimensions of the broader Palmyra story, often receiving less international attention than the dramatic destruction itself, but representing an essential foundation for whatever eventual conservation and reconstruction work the site's future circumstances may permit. The specific international scholarly networks that have continued to support Syrian heritage professionals during the period of conflict and displacement, including training programs, collaborative research initiatives, and emergency documentation projects, illustrate the broader international solidarity that has developed around the specific cause of preserving Syrian cultural heritage, even where the broader political conflict that endangers that heritage remains far from resolved. Palmyra stands in the Syrian desert today in a condition that the city's ancient builders, the merchants who financed its caravans, the priests who maintained its temples, and even Zenobia herself in her brief and dramatic bid for independent power, could never have imagined. Substantially but not completely destroyed, its most significant religious monuments reduced to rubble, its great colonnade partially standing among the ruins of structures that survived nearly 2,000 years of natural weathering only to be deliberately demolished within a matter of months by a force whose specific ideological commitments had no place for the religious and cultural synthesis that Palmyra had once represented so completely. The oasis that gave Palmyra its reason for existing is still there, the same springs still producing the same mineral-rich water that supported human settlement in this specific desert location for thousands of years before the caravan trade made Palmyra wealthy and for the centuries since the trade routes shifted and the city's strategic importance faded. The desert that surrounds the ruins is the same desert that the city's merchants once crossed with their loaded camels, financing expeditions to bring silk from China and spices from India to markets that stretched across the entire breadth of the Roman Mediterranean world. What Palmyra represented, before its catastrophic destruction, was a specific kind of cultural achievement that deserves to be remembered and understood on its own terms. A city built by merchants rather than by emperors, a religious tradition that absorbed and transformed influences from across the ancient Near East without losing its own distinctive character. A funerary art that gave ordinary wealthy families the same kind of monumental commemoration that elsewhere in the Roman world was typically reserved for emperors and the highest aristocracy, and briefly, for a few remarkable years under an extraordinary queen, an independent political power that dared to challenge the authority of Rome itself at the height of that empire's 3rd century crisis. The stones that remain, scattered now among the rubble of what was destroyed, still carry the specific marks of the people who carved them. The careful Greek and Aramaic lettering of the Palmyrene tariff, the individual faces of the dead preserved in funerary portraiture that gave each deceased Palmyrene merchant or merchant's wife a permanent place in the visual memory of their community. The precise astronomical and architectural calculations that aligned the Temple of Bel with the same careful attention to cosmic order that characterized religious architecture across the ancient world. These details survive in the photographs, the scholarly publications, and the digital scans made before the destruction, even where the physical stones themselves have been reduced to rubble, ensuring that what Palmyra was, and what it achieved across the centuries of its prosperity, remains available to be studied, remembered, and eventually, perhaps at least partially rebuilt. What happened at Palmyra in the 3rd century, and what happened again in the 21st, share a common thread that the city's long history makes visible with unusual clarity. the persistent vulnerability of even the most prosperous and architecturally accomplished civilizations to the political and military forces that periodically reshape the ancient and modern world alike. Zenobia's rebellion failed because the underlying strength of the Roman imperial system, however badly shaken by decades of crisis, ultimately proved sufficient to reassert central control. The destruction inflicted by the Islamic State succeeded, at least in the immediate term, because the broader international community lacked the specific military and political capacity to prevent it, even as that same community possessed the documentation, the expertise, and the will to begin imagining what eventual restoration might look like. The oasis endures regardless of these political fortunes, producing the same water it has produced for thousands of years, indifferent to whether the city that depends on it is ruled by a Roman client king, an independent Palmyrene queen, a Roman emperor reasserting central authority, or whatever government eventually achieves enough stability to oversee Palmyra's long-term future. The desert surrounding the oasis is equally indifferent, the same harsh and beautiful landscape that made the caravan trade necessary and profitable in the first place, still extending in every direction exactly as it did when the first Palmyrene merchants organized the first profitable caravan crossing between the Euphrates and the Mediterranean coast. The specific cultural memory of Palmyra that persists among Syrians and the broader international community, encompassing both grief over what has been lost and determination to preserve and eventually restore what remains, suggests that the city's significance has if anything been deepened rather than diminished by the catastrophe of recent years, transforming Palmyra from simply an impressive archaeological ruin into a living symbol of the broader struggle to preserve human cultural heritage against deliberate destruction. Whatever Palmyra eventually becomes, whether a fully reconstructed monument to its ancient prosperity, a partially restored site that honors both what survived and what was lost, or simply a permanently altered ruin that bears visible witness to both its ancient glory and its modern catastrophe, the specific history that the city represents of trade connecting distant civilizations, of religious synthesis producing genuinely new forms of artistic and architectural expression, and of a remarkable woman who briefly dared to challenge the authority of Rome itself, will remain available to anyone willing to engage with the substantial scholarly record that survives regardless of what ultimately happens to the physical stones themselves. The stones may crumble further, or they may eventually rise again under careful and patient restoration. But the history they represent, of merchants crossing impossible distances to connect civilizations that had no other means of contact, of priests and architects building a religious tradition that belonged to no single culture but drew freely on many, and of a queen who briefly made the desert itself the seat of an empire, belongs now to the permanent record of what human beings have proven capable of building, and what they have proven capable of destroying, and what, against all odds, sometimes survives both. The oasis is still producing water. The desert is still waiting. And somewhere in the gap between what Palmyra was and what Palmyra has become, there is still a story worth telling, carefully, to anyone willing to listen long enough to hear all of it. Palmyra is waiting for that listener now, as it has waited through every previous chapter of its long and complicated history, patient in the way that only ruins, oases, and deserts know how to be patient. That patience has already outlasted one empire, one rebellion, one queen, and one act of deliberate destruction. It will very likely outlast whatever comes next as well. The oasis was here first, and it will still be here, producing the same mineral-rich water under the same desert sky, long after every empire that has ever claimed this small but consequential stretch of Syrian desert has had its turn and passed into history alongside Palmyra itself. The water does not know it is famous. It simply continues to flow. That, in the end, may be the most important thing left to say about Palmyra, that the place outlasts the story, and the water outlasts the stone, and somewhere in the desert tonight, the same spring that gave a small oasis town its reason for existing thousands of years ago is still quietly doing exactly what it has always done. If this documentary has kept you company through the night, Consider subscribing so you never miss the next quiet journey. And if you are ready for another story from the ancient world, there is one waiting for you on the screen now.